Looking at the piece today, it's hard to imagine that this place was once a bomb crater at the center of one of the fiercest wars of the 20th century. I'm Amiad Horowitz. I'm a journalist. I love learning about history, including the history of the country in which I live, Vietnam. Especially as an American, I want to understand more about the Vietnamese people's war of resistance against the United States. I want to find out for myself the answer to the question of how a once small, poor country like Vietnam fought and won against a superpower like the US and rose to the strength it has today. I am very fortunate to have been accompanied and supported by my Vietnamese colleagues in this journey.
Ai đã tới miền quê em Quảng Trị Thừa Thiên, qua đường chín tình gió linh lắng nghe giọng hò. Mừng vui bao tin thắng trận, sông Ba Lòng bay bồng lời ca. Quê nhà ta nay đã đổi thay lớn lên từng ngày.
Bác muốn người Mỹ sẽ biết gì về chiến tranh Mỹ ở Việt Nam?
Tức là tâm nguyện thì chúng tôi là những người lính thì cũng muốn người Mỹ này hiểu lại sau những cái năm tháng những cựu chiến binh Mỹ đã từng tham chiến ở Việt Nam trở lại cái vùng quê khai xanh hướng hóa. Hôm nay thì nhìn thấy là cái sự nó thay đổi, ngoài những cái về Mỹ, chắc là những cựu chiến binh Mỹ cũng không thể tưởng tượng ra là nó có cái màu xanh ấy trở lại như thế. Thì ngày xưa người Mỹ có xác định là gần như là cái khe xanh là hàng trăm năm sau cây cối có thể mọc lại được. Nhưng mà đúng là cũng đến hôm nay thì đúng là một cái 55 năm thôi, nhưng mà mọi cái ở khe xanh nó đã đổi mới hoàn toàn. Nó có những đồn điền cà phê rồi có những cái là công trình điện gió, tức là nếu nói đúng là đất đã hồi sinh. Nhưng mà thực ra tôi tham gia cái cuộc chiến tranh chống nước này thì thực tế là biết là từ mậu thân, mà chúng tôi là ở đây chính xác là hết năm 13. Tức là sau khi đánh giải phóng tỉnh Quảng Trị và cho đến kết thúc chiến tranh Việt Nam, khi vào đến Dinh Độc Lập, sau ngày giải phóng và sau khi tôi nghỉ năm 2007 thì gần như năm nào ít nhất cũng phải là 4 lần là vào thăm những người đã khuất và gặp lại những người đã sống.
Chào bác. Chào đồng chí Vinh. Chào bác.
Đấy, giới thiệu với các bác, đây là ban quản lý Nghĩa Trang, đồng chí trưởng ban phó ban, và đây đồng chí Lãm là bộ đội cũ, và đây là anh nhà báo người Mỹ. Nhưng mời các anh cho tôi lên trên lên tháp hương. Hỏi lại vào thăm các chiến hữu đồng đội. Tôi nguyên quân nhân sư đoàn Anh Tư về thăm các anh cho tôi cùng với đoàn công tác chia sẻ mạnh khỏe. Hàng năm có điều kiện là vào hương khói thăm các đồng chí, vì cái điều kiện chiến tranh nó quá lâu lắm rồi. Tức là giới thiệu với bạn là đây là căn cứ Thà Cơn, là cái căn cứ mạnh nhất của quân đội Mỹ trong thời kỳ chiến tranh Việt Nam. khi vào đây là có lập theo cái hệ thống hàng rào móc mara, cũng nghĩ là Bắc Việt Nam là không thể vượt qua được, nhưng cũng không ngờ là Mậu Thân thì là bộ đội Việt Nam là đã tập kích đánh thẳng vào đây, và trận đánh kéo dài toàn bộ cái khu vực Tà Cơn này và Lăng Vây là trong vòng 50 ngày đêm. Mà mở màn chiến dịch là tháng 1 và kết thúc là tháng 6. Người Mỹ đành phải bỏ Khe Xanh. Thì về phía quân đội Việt Nam thì cũng tạo điều kiện để cho hơn 5.000 lính thủy đánh bộ Mỹ và kỵ binh bay là rút khỏi chiến trường Khe Xanh. 55 năm trước, và hôm nay là chúng ta gặp nhau đây, nhưng mà không ai nghĩ là sau 55 năm về đây, cái vùng chiến khu xưa mà nó lại được thay đổi thế này. Chứ ngày xưa ai nghĩ có cái cột điện gió này. 55 năm trước mà nhìn cột điện gió này, nghĩ như cái B-52 nó bay.
In the memoir, Portrait of a 304th Division Soldier, recounted by former veterans who directly fought on the Battle of Khe at the beginning of November 1967, the division received orders to march into the battlefield and engage in combat in the Khe area, which is now the town of Khe Hunghua District, Guangxi Province. The plan for the general offensive and the uprising during the Tet Offensive in 1968 was kept secret until the last minute. Only after the attacks on cities and towns had taken place were we informed of the mission of the Route 9 Khe campaign, which aimed to draw the enemy in, keep them trapped in the mountainous jungle for several days, and create favorable conditions for our main offensive targeting the cities and towns. The Khe military base was the center of an electronic fence system constructed as the strongest and most fortified defensive complex of the United States in the northern region of South Vietnam. It includes the fortified positions of Lang Vai, Camp Hunghua, Hue San, and Tacon Airfield Defense Cluster. The entire defensive line of Route 9 Khe stretches nearly 20 kilometers from the southern 17th parallel to Route 9, spanning 100 kilometers along the Binh Hai River to the Vietnam-Laos border. With this fortified defensive line, the United States hoped to prevent the North Vietnamese Liberation Forces from launching offensives or infiltrating the temporary military demarcation line into the south. The U.S. government also believed that Khe Sanh would be a disastrous ending for the North Vietnamese army. However, the U.S. did not expect that the Liberation Forces would fiercely fight back to retake Khe Sanh and pin down U.S. forces on the battlefield. On the night of January 20th and the early morning of January 21st, 1968, the artillery campaign of the 304th Division, the Liberation Forces, launched a surprise offensive with consecutive and powerful attacks, targeting multiple important objectives in Khe Sanh. This created a significant surprise, forcing the U.S. forces at Khe Sanh to fight from fortified positions and bunkers. Resupply could only be carried out through airlift. From February 8th to March 31st, the U.S. forces at Khe Sanh were besieged and under constant shelling for 50 days and nights. On June 26th, the U.S. military was ordered to withdraw from Khe Sanh. On June 27, 1968, the AP news agency wrote, "The withdrawal of U.S. forces from Khe Sanh is a failure for the U.S." Senior U.S. officials had previously said this base must be defended at all costs. On June 30, 1968, the BBC radio broadcast stated, "The retreat from Khe Sanh is not simply abandoning a stronghold, it's abandoning an illusion and a policy that all U.S. efforts have built, now crumbling like the fortified concrete steel bunkers at Khe Sanh." After 170 days and nights encircling Khe Sanh, on July 9, 1968, the victory flag of the Liberation Army flew over Ta Khon Military Airport, marking the victory of the Route 9 Khe Sanh campaign, contributing significantly to the success of the general offensive and the uprising during the Tet Offensive in 1968, a decisive victory on the military front, forcing the U.S. to de-escalate the war and start the peace negotiation process. In the United States, right from the 1960s and early 1970s, the protest movement against the Vietnam War took place with great enthusiasm, attracting millions of people regardless of skin color, age, or gender. Immediately after the 1968 Tet Offensive, the anti-war movement became stronger and stronger. A large number of Americans and peace-loving people of other countries opposed the continuous U.S. military escalation in Vietnam. Violent anti-war demonstrations had a strong impact on the U.S. government, forcing the U.S. to stop bombing and negotiate at the Paris Peace Conference.
I was involved with the Indochina Peace Campaign, which started with Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda to travel around the United States talking to people just about Vietnam to get attention to it. Because the Paris Agreement, the Paris Accords, were going to be negotiated now, and we wanted to put pressure on the American government to sign the accords. And we were very successful with this. A lot of people heard us. A lot of attention was raised to Vietnam, and the Paris Accords were signed.
The Vietnam War began in 1954 and lasted for 21 years. In addition to the great loss of life for both sides, the war also left heavy spiritual losses along with serious problems affecting the economy, society, and the environment. It was the American veterans returning from the war in Vietnam who witnessed the war firsthand that helped the U.S. public understand the nature of the war, sway public opinion against the war.
I believe one of the reasons America went to war with Vietnam is because it did not understand Vietnam's history. It did not understand Vietnam's culture. It did not understand the Vietnamese people and the Vietnamese people quest for peace and freedom. If the United States would have understood that, we never would have come to war.
Having been involved in the peace movement, protesting against the war, and actively engaged in translating books on the topic of the Vietnam War, American writer-journalist Lady Borton, now in her 80s, still frequently visits Vietnam as her second homeland. The woman named Ut Ly in Vietnam is recognized as a loyal and steadfast friend of the Vietnamese people. As an observer of the war in Vietnam, she stated that Vietnam has always been proactive in people-to-people diplomacy and promoting peace since the early stages of the conflict.
The Vietnamese organized friendship meetings between Americans in the peace movement and themselves. So the first one was women, and that was July of 1965 in the Marines land in March, so it's only a few months later. So it's what the Vietnamese call people's diplomacy. So it's people with people. What became very clear to me, but I had always seen, the Vietnamese never thought they could negotiate with the Americans. We're too big, too much material. But it allowed them to be in Paris, and Paris was the media center of Europe. And so from Paris, they could, each of those weekly meetings where nothing happened, right? Nothing happened, right? Except afterwards, out came Sun Tui, absolutely gorgeous man with his beautiful smile, and Madame Bin's really gorgeous, fluent French, and they spoke to the international press. So that was the story, and they told the story of what was happening in the North and the South. And the Vietnamese organized it so that every week there was a special envoy who went from the South carrying film and stories and went from the South up the Ho Chi Minh Trail to Hanoi. And then they radioed that. When the delegation in Paris presented, they had documents and stories of the My Lai massacre and of the prisoners in Con Dao and all the rest. We didn't believe it, but there it was. And they met with anyone who came, whether it was veterans, people who were anti-war, people who were pro-war. They would meet with anybody and tell their story. And that's what they were busy doing.
So from your perspective, the Vietnamese people were seeking peace from the very beginning.
Absolutely.
Hey. Hi, Amir.
Hi, good to see you.
Good to see you. Welcome. A book written in any language.
There is a special connection to Vietnam for the artist George Burchett. Although he did not participate in the Vietnam War, he had a profound perspective on the conflict. His father was the famous Australian journalist Wilfred Burchett, who exposed the truth about many wars around the world, including the war in Vietnam.
I was born in Hanoi 1 year after Dien Bien Phu, and my father reported the Vietnam War. Two Vietnam Wars, the French War and the American War. So I grew up with the story of the war because my father spent time in the jungles of the South, or also in the North while it was being bombed. So that was the story I grew up with, the heroic struggle for independence and unity of the Vietnamese people.
So can you talk a little bit about the role your father played in making sure the true information about the war reached Western audiences?
He was the first Westerner to go and spend 6 months in the liberation zones of Vietnam with the NLF, the National Liberation Front. He used to write regularly for a left-wing newspaper called The Guardian, who was very influential in building up public opinion, especially in the US, against the war. And his books were very well read, and his films and photos. So little by little, people got to know more about the war, and people started to realize that which side was fighting a just cause and which side was just blowing up villages and poisoning, destroying the nature and killing lots of people.
So among your father's many unique experiences, perhaps the most unique was his interview with Ho Chi Minh, President Ho Chi Minh. Can you tell us a little bit about that interview?
Well, that was in 1966, and actually there's a little anecdote here because my father was actually interviewing Prime Minister Pham Van Dong, and then Uncle Ho, I always call him Uncle Ho, came to just to say hello, and my father said, "President, can I ask a question?" And Uncle Ho said, "Okay." So the question is, Mr. President, can you say a few words to the French people and to people of the world about this war? And so President Ho Chi Minh's answers, that was in '66 after the Americans started bombing the North Vietnam as well. So I think President Ho Chi Minh gave the perfect answer. Who would have thought that Vietnam would win against not just the greatest war machine, but all its allies and all its power, propaganda power, but it happened, and that's a historic fact. So I think Uncle Ho sums it up perfectly, because it's a just war, it's a patriotic war, and also we have the support of almost everybody.
Yeah. 50 years have passed since the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, a crucial step towards true peace for Vietnam, which was realized 2 years later. The people who were once at opposing sides of the battlefront now have the opportunity to meet each other at the place known as the City for Peace.
Hôm nay là được gặp lại các bạn, chúng tôi rất vui và rất mong rằng là được nghe những cái tâm sự, những cái trao đổi của các bạn để chúng ta có thể hiểu nhau hơn.
To thank you for taking the time at this very busy season to meet with us here today. I was here in Vietnam the first two times in 1971 and 1972. So my activities in the war started much later than all of yours. I had the opportunity to come back to Vietnam in 1981 as part of the first delegation of American veterans to return to Vietnam. And even though it had been almost 10 years since I had been to war, my memories of Vietnam were still of the war. And none of us had any idea what to expect when we came to Vietnam. One day we had the opportunity to walk about Hanoi. People would come up to us and say, "Are you the American veteran?" And we would say yes, and they would say, "Welcome to Vietnam." It totally blew our minds. How could people be so welcoming to the people that helped cause the death and destruction? We're in Hanoi. The more those time-frozen images of war disappeared. And instead of thinking about Vietnam as a war, began to think about Vietnam as a country. A beautiful country made up of extraordinary people with their own hopes and dreams for a better life. You are right, we are getting old. And the opportunities to have these type of exchanges will become few. But as you know, it is important to always remember the past so that we don't make the mistakes again in the future.
Tôi thì là một cựu chiến binh vào miền Nam chiến đấu. Lúc đấy tôi là sinh viên đang học ở Hà Nội. Tuy rằng đang chiến đấu ác liệt như vậy, chúng tôi là những người lính chiến, không bao giờ chúng tôi sợ chết. Đấy. Không bao giờ chúng tôi sợ chết. Mà chỉ sợ không hoàn thành được nhiệm vụ của nhân dân Việt Nam chúng tôi giao phó. Chúng tôi cũng biết được những người lính phản chiến ở Mỹ và nhân dân Mỹ ủng hộ cuộc kháng chiến chống Mỹ cứu nước của chúng tôi. Và tôi cũng rất cảm động. Cuối cùng thì chúng tôi cũng rất là mong muốn cái mối quan hệ của chúng ta bây giờ bình thường hóa quan hệ và muốn là gắn bó giữa cựu chiến binh để chúng ta truyền đạt cho những con cháu đời sau bảo vệ hòa bình chung của nhân loại.
The war is over. The soldiers of both Vietnam and the United States no longer see each other as former enemies, but rather respect each other as true friends, reflecting on the past and looking towards the future. Having experienced countless losses and pain, Vietnam understands the value of peace more than anyone else. The desire for peace and independence has driven millions of Vietnamese hearts to fight and overcome one of the most powerful enemies in the world. The same burning aspiration continues to ignite the minds of millions of Vietnamese to build a strong and mighty nation. As an American citizen, I admire Vietnam for what you have given to young people like me, an understanding of the value of peace. It is not just the absence of gunfire. Above all, it is the genuine happiness of the people that I have witnessed firsthand in a place once devastated by bombs and bullets. As Mr. Bin remarked, the land has been reborn. The rice seeds have sprouted and grown on the land once contaminated by dioxin of war. Now I have found the answer to why Vietnam has emerged victorious and grown strong as it is today. If in the past journalist Wilfred Burchett brought the truth about America's war in Vietnam to the attention of the Western public, then now, with the responsibility of a journalist and a citizen of the younger generation, I feel the need to present the image of a beautiful and vibrant country, rich in patriotic traditions, overcoming difficulties, continuing on the path to socialism, and emerging strong to global readers.